John Rapley, welcome to Careers That Matter. What is your job, and what does a week look like for you in being able to fulfill your responsibilities?
So, yeah, what is my job? I've had several, Stuart, and I guess I would sum it up that I'm an academic and a writer, mostly writing now. I began my career as an academic, and then I gradually moved over into the area of both journalism and policy advocacy, and then I created a think tank at one time in my life to do with the field of development. And having acquired that kind of experience, hands-on experience of the policy process of running a business, then ultimately returned to Britain, where I resumed the writing life, did some lecturing at the University of Cambridge, and then more recently, I just find that I am spending all my time, almost all my time at the moment, doing writing. I still do a small amount of lecturing, but I do a lot of these interviews, and a week is spent in conversations with editors who would like material. A lot of it is sort of commentary on the world right now, the economics, the global economy, or what the Middle East war means for, for the world economy, what the bond markets mean for the Canadian property sector, and sort of trying to make things practical and real to ordinary people, and then writing that material. And in addition to which, I sort of publish books as well. I have a book that just came out just over a month ago, actually, called Why Empires Fall, which puts all of this into international context. It basically says that we in the West, and that includes Canada, Canada likes to see itself as the good guy in world affairs, but as I put it in the book and in an article I wrote when the book came out in North America, Canada was always at the heart of the biggest empire and the richest empire of history, and did very well off that ride. But empires have a life cycle, and the Western Empire is now into a relative decline phase. Doesn't mean it will fall, doesn't mean it will cease to be a significant global player, but it's not going to be anywhere near as easy as it's been. And that is the sort of the background context for the discussion you and I had about Canada's place in the world, is that it's changing. It's changing quite rapidly. And I don't think it has really dawned on Canadians yet just how different the future is going to look from the past. So, the last 100 years, at the start of the 20th century, Wilfrid Laurier famously said that the 20th century would be Canada's century, and he wasn't wrong. Canada was a country that probably benefited more than just about any from that ascendant phase of the imperial life cycle. The next 100 years are going to look very different, and if it's to be Canada's century, Canada will have to do a lot more work than it had to do in the 20th century, when it was really able just to get a free ride.
So, coming back to your current position in career, you indicated that you're a writer. So, on a day-to-day basis, how much of your time do you devote to actually writing, or is it a mix of writing and researching, formulating ideas, and so on, to be able to then complete what it is that you're putting together that will hopefully become a book or articles for newspapers and so on?
Yeah, and what I tend to do, Stuart, is work on both simultaneously. So I'm doing these articles while I am working on a book, and often the articles feed into the book, or often the work for the book feeds into the articles, vice versa. I would say, Hemingway famously said that the grace of the iceberg's movement owes to the fact that nine-tenths of it is underwater, and he was referring to the literary process, and I think that goes for research as well. What makes it into the public domain, what I actually write, is about a tenth of the work. 90% of it is never seen. It is that research. So I spend a great deal of time, whether it's speaking with colleagues or doing research, gathering material. And I have this small research company based in Britain called Seaford Macro, where colleagues and I work in economic policy and macroeconomic analysis. So there's quite a lot of that going on in the background. Out of that, the actual writing process would be a minority of my time, but it's what everyone gets to see. And there's a lot of weeding out when you're actually producing something. There's a lot of that material, as it were, that if it were a film, you'd say it's on the cutting room floor. It's the stuff that doesn't make it into the public domain, but is an important part of that 9/10 of the iceberg that keeps the top tenth moving.
So, are you able to write that way in the sense that, as you say, it's the minority of your time because you've already formulated the thoughts and ideas in your mind? I remember in that great movie Amadeus, Mozart said to, I think it was Salieri, well, it comes out of me. At the point that you sit down to actually start to put thoughts to paper, do you find yourself in that situation? It's formulated in your mind, and it's almost as though you're dictating what you've been thinking.
I think I wouldn't quite put it that way. What I do think of, Edison's famous adage that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Not that I'd credit myself with any genius, but I think if we sort of say that's the creative process, you do start with that inspiration, that sense that there's something going on here. I can't say what it is, but I want to figure out, and I know the answers I'm getting aren't actually correct. And I think that this is why one of the complaints I've had with colleagues, we were talking in an earlier interview I did with you on universities in Canada. One of the problems is I think that academics have become increasingly remote from the world they're meant to study, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, which is presumably studying the world in which we live. And I do think, I made a decision. I started my career in Oxford doing development economics. And I came to feel, I had that moment of inspiration that I'm not really getting what's going on here. Field research only allows me to gather data, but I'm not actually experiencing development and what it means. And I needed to go live and work in the developing world. And so I actually moved to the developing world and spent a good chunk of my career living there, immersed in that environment. And I must say that gave me a whole range of insights I would never have otherwise formed. And I think in the same way that I think, for example, someone who works in economics and the economics of business really should spend some time working in a business. I think someone who does agricultural economics, there was a time when they would be expected to go actually work on a farm and actually acquire firsthand knowledge. That's now frowned upon as being sort of, well, that's not useful. That's time you really could be spending refining your models. But I think we've lost a great deal. I think, yes, we're able to spend more time doing productive work, but we're not getting good inspiration.
So, because this program that we're talking about right now is largely directed at people who are beginning their careers, to somebody who looks at you and goes, I want a career like yours, what do you think are the most important personal attributes that one would need to have success following in your footsteps?
Well, I would say, first thing I'd say, Stuart, is I wouldn't necessarily advise anyone to follow in my footsteps. It's a very unique path I've followed, and it's not for everyone. You have to be willing to forego a lot of job security if you're going to live essentially what amounts to a freelance life. I mean, I've had various jobs along the way, but the actual income you make from any kind of writing, it depends ultimately on sales. You're essentially an entrepreneur, and you have to be prepared to take risks. And with that go the returns that sometimes justify the risk and sometimes don't. What I would say is, I think there's a lot to be said for trying to not to limit your focus into becoming too highly specialized. I mean, it makes sense to be highly specialized if you're doing, medicine, or certainly certain types of medicine, where you really just want to spend your time getting more and more precise in what you do. But when you're studying humans and anything to do with the economy, ultimately you're dealing with human consumers, human producers. The same goes for any kind of policy. Is humans are extraordinarily complicated. You can't approach them in a specialized manner, and I think the attempt that we've made to do so not only limits our understanding of humans, but I think we're not producing people who are necessarily going to be the most productive. They can be very good at one thing, but not necessarily good at shifting skills. And if you look at the rate in which technology changes, the pace, the speed at which it changes today, that the skills that make you well prepared for the job market when you graduate from university will be all obsolete by the time you finish your career. You have to be able to shift and move, and several times in the course of your life learn entirely new skills, and that requires flexibility. And I think flexibility is and adaptability are really important attributes that we don't perhaps stress enough.
Well, I agree. Thanks for giving us a glimpse into your world and your career. Appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.